Hey y'all, so I wanted to make this video about why I do colorism healing. What inspired me to start this work? What was my personal journey towards being the woman that I am today, doing the work that I'm doing now? So, for those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Sarah L. Webb, and in 2013, I started an initiative called Colorism Healing. Colorism Healing began as a blog because I'm a writer, and so I felt like I wanted to write to address the issue of colorism. And since then, I've also had international writing contests that have attracted thousands of submissions, and I've reached thousands of people through workshops, through my writing, through articles on my own blog, as well as articles in places like Teaching Tolerance and Blavity and For Harriet. And I'm also currently an assistant professor of English at the University of Illinois in Springfield. And the reason why I went back to get my doctorate is because I had been doing work on colorism, and I felt like it was the right thing, for the right next step for me to be able to study more about colorism, to do more research, and to do more writing on the topic. And I always wanted to go back and get a PhD, but I didn't know what I would get it in. And so when I discovered my work on colorism, I knew that that was the right area of study for me to then go in and pursue the higher degree. I recently taught my first college course on colorism. I called it #Melanin, International Perspectives on Skin Tone. And I've published collections of poetry and essays from people who submitted to my writing contest. And I'm even working on publishing my own book, my first single authored book on colorism as well. So I kind of want to talk about my history, my origin story about why I do this. And yeah, so let's dive into that. So I'll begin with my early childhood, and as with many things, it starts at home, it starts with the family. And so I was born the youngest child of three into a family that had a relatively light-skinned mother and a relatively dark-skinned father. My oldest sibling is my brother, who is also relatively dark, and then my sister, the middle child, is very light-skinned relative to the other people in the immediate family. And so my immediate family, I didn't really experience or see colorism in the household, right? And so my parents divorced when I was about 7, so I grew up with just my mom and my sister and my brother for the most part. And we all really loved each other. We were very close and still are to this day. And we never showed any differential treatment or preference for one or the other based on skin tone. So I definitely applaud my mother in that regard, and much love to my siblings, who never made me feel less than, or who never displayed colorism within the house or outside of the household. But it was outside of the household where I learned and recognized that people saw me differently because of my darker skin, and that people treated me differently because of my darker skin. And when I say outside of my household, I also mean media and television. So that was a big issue for me growing up, was not seeing enough black women in general, but also dark-skinned black women with my type of hair, etc. Although there were more dark-skinned women on TV, it seemed, in the 90s, with shows like Family Matters and Living Single, right? There was a wider representation of black women, I think, at the height of the 90s. But definitely going to school and seeing how people, because my sister is not too much older than me, we're relatively close in age and we're both girls, people often compared us to each other, friends of the family, classmates, people at church. So it was always a comparison between me and her. I was the stuck-up one, or the mean one. I got that a lot. Or I had a bad attitude, right? And it's no coincidence that I also happen to be the darker one. And I learned now later in life that, yeah, I was kind of in a bad mood, but it's coming from a place of anger and hurt and resentment by the fact that I felt like people didn't see me. I felt invisible. I felt like people always overlooked me or dismissed me as being less beautiful or less worthy than my sister or other light-skinned girls, other light-skinned cousins, light-skinned friends, or just light-skinned classmates, light-skinned church members. I always felt that disparity in how people saw me and treated me. And so that did cause me to have a chip on my shoulder when I was younger. And it often was displayed by either withdrawing and not wanting to interact or engage, or anger or hurt and sadness, right? And my mom tells me the story that when I was about the age of 5, so it was before I have conscious memory of it, but she remembers an instance when we were visiting family in a hospital, and some of my great aunts were talking about how attractive and pretty my older sister was, and saying how, oh, Janice, you'll have to watch out for that one, speaking of my older sister, because she's going to break some hearts one day, she's so pretty, she's going to, well, they didn't necessarily say pretty, or I don't know exactly what they said, because I don't remember the incident, but the way my mom tells it, that they were saying my sister's going to be a heartbreaker, she's going to break some hearts one day. And in my little 5-year-old mind, I understood what that meant. I recognized, even as a young child, that they were saying something about my sister and not saying it about me. That I was not supposed to break hearts. That no one was ever going to be heartbroken over me, because who would want me as a dark-skinned girl, right? I understood that even as a kid. Tangent, that's why I always tell parents it's never too early to start talking to your kids about colorism, because they already see it. At least I did, okay? And my mom says I responded to that under my breath, not necessarily to anyone in particular, but that she heard me say, that's because she's light-skinned, right? So even in my young child, toddler mind, I knew I had already had enough experiences in the past prior to that moment where I recognized that people showed more favor and more appreciation and more admiration for my older sister and for other light-skinned girls than they ever showed for me. And I was already feeling that and understanding that that's how people in my environment and people in the world worked. And as I got older, going through grade school and high school, of course I heard the guy saying they only date light-skinned girls, they don't date dark-skinned girls. In a dance class one time, a young black girl looked at me, who wasn't very much lighter than me, she was a medium brown herself, looked at me and said, ew, you're so black, right? And I'm stung by that, and I try to have some kind of comment or whatever, and I'm like, oh, well, you're so brown, right? Like, not a very good comeback, but and then other instances where a white girl in my daycare, she was considered my friend, so we would play a lot, but we argued, we had a fight one time, and so she went and sat next to my sister and said, well, that's why I like your sister better than you, because she's white and you're black, right? So even non-black people differentiating between me and my sister because she was lighter and I was darker. And then that continued throughout my life, even as an adult, in my early 20s, family friends would come in and say, oh, your sister's such a pretty girl, or, Jandelle's so pretty, and then, they just say hi to me and move on, right, with no comment. But I think the big thing is that I never felt comfortable talking about this. So for a few reasons, I just kind of kept silent about what I was going through and what I was seeing and what I was observing. The first reason is that people were dismissive. People had a bad attitude about it. We talk about how colorism is a taboo subject, and I'll make a separate video on all that, but I felt like I didn't have the space or the freedom or the permission from my own community to really talk about and express how I felt. So either they were dismissive, they would try to change the subject, or they would accuse me of being jealous, right? Or they would say things like, oh, you just need to love yourself, right? As if it's all about me and that there's nothing in the community or in the culture that could change, right? So I just sucked it up. And as I got older, I realized maybe this is just something I need to deal with. I'll get over it at some point, right? And there was enough in my adult life that was distracting me from some of it. So then what inspired me to break that silence? What moved me to then finally speak up so publicly about colorism? Well, I became a teacher. I was teaching high school for the first time in my hometown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I would hear my students make colorist comments about themselves and about others, right? I would hear these students that I was so fond of say things like, I'm less proud of myself because I got dark over the summer. I would hear beautiful young women saying things like, I wish I was light-skinned like my mama. Or, light-skinned students saying, I don't really like dark-skinned people when I first meet them. I'd have to try to get to know them first. And that's when I realized that colorism wasn't just my experience. I wasn't just crazy or just needed to get over it, that the issue was bigger than me. It was beyond me. And it wasn't just my problem. I think before growing up, I think I might have just thought, well, maybe I am just extra sensitive, or maybe it's not that big of a deal because no one else seems to be talking about it. But hearing these young people continue to have that mindset and perpetuate that mindset, that's what compelled me to get beyond my own story and share and have these discussions with a larger audience, because I didn't want to sit by in silence while colorism continued to infect generation after generation of my people, which is what I had realized. I guess I kind of thought maybe it had dissipated with my generation growing up, but seeing that, no, it was still very much there, still very much real and present with another generation that came after me, I realized that it's not going to stop. It wasn't going to end unless we started having conversations, started addressing it, started to acknowledge it and point it out and say, this is what is happening in situations like this, and here's why it's harmful, and here's what we can do to improve these situations, right? So I had already been blogging. I started some random blog called SL Writes, and I would just write whatever came to my mind. And so over the summer, reflecting back on my experiences teaching, I wrote a blog post about colorism for the first time, and it was titled Reasons Why I've Kept Silent About Colorism So Far. Or the title was something like that. And I stated reasons why. It was right around the time when the Bill Duke documentary was coming out, Dark Girls, right? One of the most famous documentaries on colorism by Bill Duke, Dark Girls, was coming out, and I had seen a trailer for it. And so I think that also tipped the scale in terms of me being able to open up and speak and have these conversations about my own experiences and about what I observe about colorism in the society and at large. So I wrote that blog post telling people that, yes, I experienced colorism, and I kept silent about it for multiple reasons, which I stated earlier in the video. And I was terrified to publish it. It took me about 30 minutes of hovering over the publish button. My palms were sweating. My heart was actually racing, right? It was almost like I was about to jump out of a plane, right? Just clicking publish on a blog that maybe 10 people would ever read, right? But I finally did it. I finally clicked publish, and the responses were mixed, right? Most people just responded with interest, like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Other people responded with like, yeah, I'm glad you're telling this story. It needs to be said. Thank you for speaking up. And then, of course, I had some antagonism, right? I had people who were very angry and very upset that I was starting to say these things and starting to write and share my story and give my perspective on this phenomenon that happens in many communities of color, right? And that's when I knew that I needed to keep talking about it. When people were getting angry and, people I considered my friends were basically cursing me out on Facebook, I said, oh, there is something there, because we don't get triggered if there's nothing at stake. And so that's when I knew I needed to dedicate more content and more time and more conversations to colorism. So I started publishing and writing more about colorism. And so that took place in 2011. But when 2013 came around, I attended a Blogging While Brown conference. Shout out to Gina McCauley and all the Blogging While Brown fam. Love y'all. Y'all made a huge difference in my life particularly in that time of my life. I don't think I would have ever found Colorism Healing in my life if it hadn't been for the inspiration that came from the Blogging While Brown conference. So I definitely want to plug them. But attending that conference, I went back home, looked at my SL Writes blog, which was kind of trying to do a little bit of everything and anything. And I said to myself that colorism as an issue deserves its own platform, that I didn't want to water it down or drown it out by including random stuff about my quarter life crisis, right, and turning 25. So I started a blog, a website, and I called it Colorism Healing. So I knew I wanted colorism in the title, but I knew I didn't want to just put out, rehash celebrity gossip, or complain or vent about some basketball player who doesn't like dark-skinned women. I wanted to get beyond my own anger, and I wanted to get beyond shocking headlines of the latest insult from some rapper, right? And so I added the language of healing there because I wanted my conversations to be different from what I was seeing at the time. Now, mind you, this was 2013. The Bill Do documentary had just come out. And so there wasn't as much conversation about colorism online. We see a lot more of it now. There's way more content, way more mainstream content about colorism now. But in 2013, when I started Colorism Healing, it was spotty. It was hit and miss in terms of what you would find online. And most of it was, just complaining and venting and, about what celebrities had said, right? Or what some, media institution had done, right? And so I wanted to get more nuanced conversations. And I felt like colorism is such a complex issue that we can't, or I didn't want to just post sporadically or one-off posts in response to things that were happening, but I wanted to be proactive in terms of colorism healing. I wanted to be consistent and proactive in putting out content that would help people on a day-to-day level, even if it's just everything from how to start a conversation with your child and resources and books and movies you can use to just the personal catharsis of knowing that other people share your experience, right? So I wanted to have a broader, deeper, richer conversation about colorism that I hadn't seen online at that time. And as I started Colorism Healing. And like I said, after doing that work for a couple of years, I realized that that was something I was passionate enough about to motivate me to go back to get my doctorate and to finish. And so yes, I wrote my dissertation on colorism healing, started the contest. I have met so many wonderful people from around the world who are great writers and great storytellers and very inspirational, and for me and for each other. So seeing that conversation happen among the writers has been a beautiful thing. And so I look forward to seeing where colorism healing goes in the future, right? So this YouTube content that I'm starting to put out is a new development, right? And I love the idea of evolving. I think the Colorism Healing Initiative is very much a part of my personal identity, right? As an individual, as a dark-skinned Black woman with 4C natural hair, as a word nerd, a writer, an English professor, Colorism Healing definitely takes on a lot of my own personality and my own identity and my own experiences. But in doing that, I hope to have conversations and dialogue and impact that goes beyond my personal life. And I definitely think I've done that so far, but I'm curious and interested and excited to see how, I'm led to continue that work and push it forward and push it in new directions, get beyond my own comfort zone, and do things with this work, with my voice, with my platform that I had only dreamt about in the past. And I want to thank all of you. So whether you've been with me since the beginning, since SL Writes, or whether this is your first time ever seeing my face or hearing my name or knowing of this work, I appreciate all of you for any bit of attention or support or encouragement or advice or feedback that you've given me in all this time. And yeah, this is, my part of my larger life's mission. I really feel that this is part of the reason why maybe I was, created, is to start these conversations and continue these conversations. And you'll see that as my own identity in life has evolved, Colorism Healing has evolved to recognize that colorism and healing from the trauma of colorism involves so many other aspects of our lives, right? And it influences so many aspects of our lives. It influences our family dynamics. It influences our romantic relationships, our friendships, our businesses, our careers, our self-esteem and our physical and mental health, right? And so that's one big change or evolution that I'm seeing now, is that I realize, because colorism is related to all these aspects of our lives, that there is way more content that I need to, just for myself as an individual, as a messenger, that I need to bring to my community, right? Whether it's virtual, whether it's local, it's mainly because I've seen and done the work in my own life, and still doing that work in my own life. So yeah, thank you for listening thus far. And in the comments, let me know if there's something in particular that you would like to discuss, or topics that you would like to hear me talk about, or advice or feedback. If you followed me for a while, let me know what some of your favorite projects or initiatives of mine have been, and I'll definitely try to represent those in some way, or revisit those maybe in some way.